Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode for Brute for Change. I'm Ritika, I'm your host for today. This is a Green Frontier Capital initiative, and today I have with me Ms. Ulka Kelkar, who is the Executive Director for Climate at WRI India. I'll let Ulka introduce herself and talk to us more about her journey as a climate professional.
Hi, Ritika. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this podcast. Yes, my name is Ulka. I work with WRI India as the Executive Director of the Climate Program. I've been with WRI for about 5, 6 years now, but I've been working on climate policy for more than 20 years. Most of my career was with another think tank in India called TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute. I'm an economist by training. And though I started my career in Delhi, I've been in Bangalore now for a very long time. So I bring a slightly different perspective to conversations about climate change in India.
So it's very interesting, Ulka. I think you're one of the few people who've actually been in the climate space since the beginning of their careers. So how is it that you chose this field? Why was it that climate was your focus area since the beginning?
Well, to be honest, it was a personal thing. My father is a meteorologist. His PhD was, in fact, about the physics of climate change. So I think I was introduced to this concept at a very early age, and somewhere at the back of my mind, even though I didn't do science, I studied economics. When I did my master's and was introduced to environmental economics, I found that a very interesting application of economics. So it wasn't just to market issues, but actually to environmental issues. And so when I got the chance, I picked climate change as the topic of one of my term papers. And soon after graduation, I got the chance to work in TERI, which was really one of the first one or two think tanks in India working on climate change. And at TERI, one of the things that I was exposed to with a lot of international researchers was how interdisciplinary this topic is. It's not only about climate or about, say, science, or not only about economics, but you can bring in all kinds of disciplines and work together as a team. So that's what I found very exciting. I've been fortunate to work on this topic since then.
That's extremely interesting. And since you work with WRI, which is obviously a very global platform and a global community, I wanted to actually understand from you where you think India fits into the decarbonization discourse and the net zero transitions, especially on a more global level. What role do you think India is going to play in the global trajectory?
Right. So India, by virtue of its scale, there are a lot of things. Any challenge becomes bigger for us, right? So the fact that we have to meet the growing energy needs of our population, we have to meet the sustainable development goals for our people. So anything in India can be a huge challenge because of scale, but that scale also opens up new opportunities that other countries might not have, other developing countries might not have. So, for example, through aggregating demand, like bringing together the demands of different sectors, you can actually bring down costs. And one example of this has been the LED lighting story in India, where because the central government gave out a big tender for LED bulbs, the cost of it was brought down because it's a bulk purchase. And so it reduced costs for everybody who wanted to actually adopt electric lighting and bring down their energy bills as well from the previous types of bulbs to these. And the same thing we are seeing recently with electric buses also, that instead of each city giving out a separate tender for a small number of buses, you can collect all of those. And in economics, particularly, we talk about economies of scale. That is when you manufacture at a larger scale, you can actually bring down costs. So I think both on the production side and on the demand side, India's scale actually opens up new opportunities in the decarbonization challenge. But definitely, it has to be a very different approach from other developing countries because we are a lower middle income country. We have to address multiple challenges all at once, environmental, social, and economic. And we have to make sure that all the connections between these we keep in mind. So it can't be that only for an environmental action, we end up having some adverse social consequence or vice versa. So I think for India, what happens is that there are no role models, there are no set patterns, no pathways that other people have already made that we just follow. It'll have to be a very unique decarbonization pathway for our country.
Absolutely. And since we're talking about decarbonization pathways, it will be really helpful for our audience If you could share some insights that would actually help establish the problem, because as everyone already knows, WRI does a lot of modeling work. So you've been able to actually track what exactly the trajectory has been and what may be the trajectory in the future. So just let's focus on the problem part for now. What is it that we've done wrong that has actually led us to this point where we're talking about climate left, right, and center?
Well, when you talk about WRI's modeling, our work is more on emissions, economy, energy. But these are scenarios of future emissions.
Mhm.
And actually, there are an infinite number of possibilities that exist, many different pathways that we could go down on. We can be very optimistic and visualize a very low carbon development pathway. But also in WRI's modeling, we focus on India because that is the context in which we
Right.
are working. But the point that you asked about, which is how did we get here? For that, we need to think not just about India, but about the world as a whole, and not look towards the future, but actually look to the back. Because what has happened is that since the Industrial Revolution, more than 150 years, there's been this buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere due to the use of fossil fuels, and these greenhouse
Right.
gases trap heat. So I think the IPCC has estimated that if you look at the historical stock of greenhouse gases that has got built up, it's about 2,500 billion tons of CO2 since 1850 to 2019. So it's that cumulative build-up year after year, mostly coming from industrialized countries in the past. And this has taken us to a temperature rise of 1 degree Celsius, compared to 150 years ago. So that's why you're getting these temperature extremes even in Europe, even like many cities like London crossing 40 degrees Celsius,
Mhm.
incredible wildfires in Canada, close to the Arctic Circle even. So these are the kinds of extreme events that we are seeing because the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 in 2019, according to the IPCC, were more than anything that has been seen in 2 million years. So what we're seeing now is really very unprecedented. It is not the result of anything that any one country can do in any one year, but it's that build-up. So this is really the kind of context in which we're working. And in terms of the future going forward, what we try to do is we try to see how you would meet the development needs of India or of different countries. How would our economy grow? How would the demand for energy increase accordingly? And then can you meet those energy needs in a cleaner way that has less of an impact on environment? And surprisingly, one of the insights that we find through our modeling is that actually not only can you develop and meet your economic goals in a sustainable, cleaner, low carbon way, it's actually something that might be good for your economy. It might create new kinds of jobs and it might actually increase the GDP a little bit. So it is not something that is environmental action at the cost of development. Indeed, the two can go hand in hand. So that is really the kind of analysis we've been doing. I'd be happy to talk more about it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a very, very important insight that you brought out, which is that decarbonization and development actually go hand in hand, which is also where our thesis comes from, which is you support green companies who actually create green jobs, to your point. But let me take a step back and ask you, since we had the global stocktake this year, we obviously know that we're not on the 1.5-degree track that was laid out by the Paris Agreement. What pathways exist for India's decarbonization in the net zero transition, and are we on track to achieve those?
Yeah, so the global stocktake was actually a process that took a few years, and it took into account the progress under the Paris Agreement. One of the sort of top line numbers that came out was that in order to stay within safe global warming of, say, around 1.5 degrees Celsius, the world's emissions as a whole need to decline by 43% by 2030 compared to where it was in 2019. And even though there has been good progress under the Paris Agreement, we're nowhere near that 43% decline. In fact, if all goes well with current commitments, we might see a decrease of 8%. So clearly, this is what the global stocktake calls an emissions gap.
Yeah.
And many people, in fact, have said that the reason there is an emissions gap is that there is a finance gap. countries like India, developing countries like India, actually can take on a lot of actions at this stage in this crucial decade of the 2020s, such as investing in renewable energy. In order to meet our energy demands, we can have more renewable energy rather than fossil energy, but provided there is timely finance. So that's really, I think, when you say what are the pathways that might be available to us, it needs, I think, two things for us, right? And as I said before, our modeling shows that we can have significant reductions in emissions even as we meet our energy needs and as we develop as an economy. But there have to be certain timely policies. So maybe mandates set in this decade at an early stage that exploit that scale that India has, right, of scaling up renewable energy. So something like our 500 gigawatt target for renewable energy, for non-fossil energy, can be quite transformative. But the make or break action or the need is the finance. If the finance doesn't come in a timely way, then a lot of these opportunities might get missed. We might invest in, say, for example, fossil fuel energy or other kinds of land use patterns that are more inefficient. And even low-hanging fruits like energy efficiency in our buildings, our lighting, opportunities to electrify, transport, cooking, many of these actions might get missed if we don't have the right kind of finance at the right time.
So, since we're speaking of finance, do you think that India's decarbonization can actually be led by the private sector in any way? And if yes, which sectors do you think the private sector can actually take the lead?
Absolutely. I think the private sector can take a lead in all the important sectors that we speak about when we talk about decarbonization. So there's power, there's industry, there's transport, there's buildings, and then there is this cross-cutting policy lever that we try to include, namely having a price on carbon. And I'll explain each of these.
Yeah.
So in the power sector, I think the 500 gigawatt target that the government has, it sets a very clear trajectory. It sets a very clear direction of travel. And what the private sector can, of course, do is exploit some of the commercial returns that renewable energy is beginning to offer. So, at least in terms of large-scale, utility-scale renewable energy, it's a kind of avenue for that is just ripe for commercial investment, and we are definitely beginning to see it. If you open a newspaper every day, any day, you'll see some announcement or the other. What it needs, of course, is a little bit of policy support. By that I mean maybe some kind of risk mitigation measures. Like, for example, one of the risks that investors might feel is long-term power purchase agreements if there is any kind of change or rollback in the conditions. So that kind of risk mitigation is something that a national government or the state government can offer in order to provide the right kind of investment climate and incentives. In industry, we find this actually a difficult sector. Although there is a lot that can be done initially in terms of efficiency improvements, eventually there'll need to be a huge investment in electrifying as many industrial processes as possible, and those that can't be, looking at new fuels like green hydrogen. And here again, the government has set a mandate by saying, let's try to produce 5 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030. And our modeling, in fact, shows that this needs to increase to 20 to 30 million tons by 2050. So the direction is clear. It's still a new technology, so we need to use this current decade to make it cheaper for the industry to use. And industry can actually start thinking about how it might use this new fuel. Another issue is that of co-placement, co-location of producers and users of green hydrogen. But clearly, this is a sector where, through innovation also in green steel, green cement, industry can do a lot. Transport, again, I would say electrification is a very powerful lever, and we're already seeing a boom in the electric vehicle industry. Just last week, we had a big EV expo in Patna, in Bihar. And so I think in every corner of the economy, there's a lot of the country, there's a lot of curiosity about this. What, again, government will need to do, and is already doing to some extent, is having equal emphasis on public transport so that we don't replace fossil fuel-based vehicles by electric vehicles in a way that it creates congestion on our roads. So I think all of this has a kind of partnership where business can come in, put in investment, reap returns, for example, in building energy efficiency as well, it would lead to saving of energy costs. But what government can do is set mandates, set standards, for example, for green buildings, and also provide training and capacity and information about where, for example, architects or designers or even occupiers of buildings might be able to procure green materials for building or might be able to look at to adopt green designs. In all of this, in our modeling, there is at the back end a carbon price, which plays an important role also in incentivizing and disincentivizing some of these choices by the private sector. But it's not a very huge price. We model something like $50 per ton of CO2 by 2050. So it slowly increases from what the coal cess is now. But it provides a kind of level playing field for fossil fuels and clean energy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the very detailed answer here. I think this is extremely important. No, absolutely. I mean, this is extremely important for everyone to know and actually see where the private sector can actually take the lead, because climate is not a government problem only. And that's important to establish that. So then my next question to you is India's decarbonization approach top down, which is, are we talking about the government taking the lead on some projects? Like you mentioned, they've set the mandate for green hydrogen. Or is it bottom up, which is what is the role of an individual? For example, we've got a huge push on rooftop solar now. So what is the right approach here? And if there is a balance, then what is a very realistic strategy for a country with a size like India and the scale at which we operate?
Right. I think, as you said at the end, a country of the size and scale, but also the complexity of India,
Yeah.
where we have so many different regions which have their own unique challenges. So some which are more blessed by renewable energy resources,
Mhm.
others which are more dependent on fossil resources. So some which already have a thriving industrial sector or services sector, others which are still predominantly agrarian. So I think the complexity of our challenge
Right.
also means that we need a combination of everything that you spoke about. So the top-down approach or top-down policies really come to their own when you have the ability to set long-term mandates. So even the ability to set a net zero 2070 target gives this direction of travel to all the sectors in the economy. The demand aggregation that I spoke about earlier for LED lighting or for electric buses, that can bring about economies of scale. Also the kinds of financing, investment, and risk guarantees that we briefly touched upon earlier. Land acquisition, for instance. All of these are things that can be really very well handled by centralized agencies. So you need this for the kind of scale, especially when you're trying to create a market that doesn't exist. So,
Right.
for example, for green hydrogen or even for electric vehicles, you need that centralized kind of support. But the bottom up is equally important when it comes to implementation and also when it comes to specific aspects or specific segments of the market. So decentralized renewable energy, for example, for rural hospitals or rural schools or even farmers, small enterprises, that may be something that might get missed by an overly top-down approach or an or a solely commercial approach because it doesn't give the kinds of returns that private investors are looking for. And also, perhaps the transactions costs are very high because the beneficiaries are all quite distributed. But it's so important for our development and it's so important for rural economies to have diversified livelihood opportunities. So that's where a bottom-up approach, and when I say bottom-up approach, I mean it could be a state government-led initiative, or it could be something that's even supported by philanthropies or corporate social responsibility. So it could be many different ways. And it might be that what you really need is innovative business models or
Yeah.
different types of payment models. So it may still prove to be something that is self-sustaining, but it may just need a different kind of approach. And the last point I would say is, when you talked about what the individual can do, I think one of the very interesting studies that I think I read about in today's newspaper was about affluent Indians. And affluent is defined in this study as somebody who earns 10 lakh rupees a year. So by that definition, we have a lot of affluent Indians and their number is only increasing. As their consumption patterns change, is there a way in which the large numbers of millions of affluent Indians can through their consumption choices actually choose more sustainable or low carbon alternatives when it comes to the food they eat or the kind of clothes they wear or the way they travel or the way they commute. I think there's a lot that, again, in India, even individual behavior change adds up to a lot. So that scale is quite impressive. So I think there is stuff that all of us can do and complement the action that is being taken in a top-down way as well.
I completely agree with you. I think we've also seen, since you talked about consumer behavior, we've got a lot of consumer focused companies in our portfolio. And these are green companies that are providing sustainable solutions. And we've seen a lot of uptake by customers because these are just better products that are better for your own personal health as well. And we've actually seen that this green premium that is being talked about doesn't exist anymore, at least
Mm-hmm.
at an individual product level. We don't see there is ample price competition between a traditional product and a more sustainable product. So there's only for a consumer to choose between a higher quality and a lower quality product here. And
Mm-hmm.
since we were talking about decentralized approaches, I think WRI India does a lot of work with farmers and rural communities. So would you like to talk to us about your experience in that work and what is it that you do there?
Right. So I think there have been a number of interesting initiatives recently from which we have learned a lot. So, for example, we got the opportunity a couple of years ago to work in partnership with the Bihar government on a long-term climate resilient low carbon development strategy. So for the first time, the state was looking at timescale of decades, and it's a highly climate vulnerable state. Any study, any assessment of India always points out how climate vulnerable Bihar is already to floods in the north, droughts in the south, different other types of extreme events. When we did this study, we decided to complement the scientific assessment, the technical analysis, with a lot of conversations with government officials, but also with stakeholders in the field. So we visited a large number of areas. And for example, one of the issues that we worked on was that of wetlands and how the lakes and wetlands of Bihar are a good way of buffering against the frequent flash floods that happen, but also groundwater recharge. But you can't treat it only as a technical issue or as even as a resource issue, because there are a lot of people who live and work in these wetlands. So, for example, we did a lot of consultations with fisher folk, boat owners, and those who actually sort of use the lakes and wetlands as a source of their livelihoods. And we, in fact, even came up with some suggestions that they themselves had, like, for example, about makhana farming, which, as you know, we're all seeing in our supermarkets today.
Yeah.
So I think what happens is that it gives this kind of approach gives you a nice combination of technical information. For example, the Agriculture University in Bihar might be coming up with climate resilient crops, but then the stakeholders in the field will give you a different perspective as well, an added layer. Because often what happens is that there may be policies that exist, but by the time they reach the local level, there may be a need for some additional support. The second example I wanted to give also from Bihar was, when infrastructure is built in such a say flood prone region, of course, it takes into account these risks. So when a railway line is being built or the road is being built, it takes into account the high flood line. But what we saw was that the high flood line itself was shifting. It had already risen. So this could be partly because of climate change, partly because sedimentation and siltation from previous floods. But what we were seeing in real time was almost that the previous benchmarks of what is safe or what is climate resilient for infrastructure needs to be updated quite fast. And so, providing this kind of feedback from the field, working with the sort of local level, can inform policy so that new benchmarks can be set, new guidelines and processes can be set. Apart from this, I think WRI India has been working in a number of states on applications of the kind that we talked about earlier, decentralized renewable energy with rural hospitals, rural schools, rural women's enterprises, say, for example, cold chains or ragi mills. So I think one of the stories that we always like to highlight is how a hospital in Jharkhand was actually able to run ventilators on solar power during COVID. And I was actually able to save on diesel costs, and in fact became designated as a COVID center because they had reliable electricity. Another team in WRI India works on landscapes and looks at how a restoration-based economy can create new livelihoods, for example, around the planting of fruit trees. And this work has been done in Madhya Pradesh. So I think there's a whole range of issues that we're working on, both on the rural side as well as on the urban side.
Wonderful. These stories, it's really nice to see that actual work is happening on the adaptation side as well. Which actually brings me to my next question, which is that adaptation and loss and damage are often not talked about because it's difficult to come up with solutions at a larger scale. But this year, 2023 was monumental because COP28 actually went on to announce a loss and damage fund. Uh, Now, I have two questions here. One is that do you think a corpus of the $500 billion that has been announced so far is it sufficient? And the second is that in terms of incorporating adaptation into policy making, how do you see the Indian government's response to that?
Right. So the answer to the first question, I would say, is quite brief, which is no, it's not enough. I think there are estimates that loss and damage kind of costs in developing countries would amount to $500 billion by 2030, to $1 trillion by 2040, and more beyond. So clearly, much more funding is required. But as you said, it was a very symbolic gesture that was made in this particular COP when the Loss and Damage Fund was created and got its first capitalization, as they call it, from just a year before, when loss and damage was not even being allowed to be on the agenda of the previous COP, the Sharm el-Sheikh COP. So within a year, the entire process for what this fund should look like, how it should be managed, it was all done. So as far as COP type of negotiations go, this was super fast. So everybody is taking a lot of hope from that. On the adaptation side, I think the government of India's approach has been, of course, there are some centralized measures, like there are national missions for sustainable agriculture, there's a National Adaptation Fund. But to a large extent, adaptation is something that is part of the state action plans on climate change. So every state makes an assessment of where the adaptation needs are. Again, what is very interesting in our work with Bihar is how, in thinking longer term, while these state action plans on climate change usually take a 5-year time frame, in Bihar, when we were working with the government on a time scale of decades, what the modeling analysis shows is that new risks emerge due to climate change.
Right.
Areas which were perhaps always drought prone now have to think in the future even about extreme rainfall events, or areas which had never had to think about heat stress and are tourist places have to start preparing in the future for heat action plans as well. So this in taking this longer term perspective, we see new hotspots of vulnerability beginning to emerge. And the approach that is being taken largely in India and in Indian states is that of mainstreaming these adaptation concerns into ongoing sectoral policies. So if the agriculture development agriculture department has a policy, it should gear that towards climate resilient agriculture. If the water resources department has certain schemes and certain funding, it should start thinking about making groundwater and surface water resilient even to changing rainfall patterns. So the approach is largely that of mainstreaming climate into the existing budget resources. And while that's a very, very good approach, I think it is also a bit of a compromise because of the relative lack of global international climate finance and the difficulty in accessing whatever international climate finance there is. So I think on adaptation, a lot is happening, but a lot more can be done, provided that finance is provided in a timely way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one point that I took from your last answer was that there is a lot of collaboration that needs to happen across departments, because you can talk about a building, but you also need to make sure that that building is sustainable. So infrastructure needs to meet the climate change requirements. So since you served as the co-chair of Think 20, which was G20's think tank arm, Think 20's task force on clean energy and green transitions, you must have seen a lot of collaborative power in the policy making community. What is it that you would like to share here? Were there any noteworthy collaborations or solutions that actually came out of that entire exercise?
Yeah, no, it was a very, very interesting, very eye-opening exercise for me. I was exposed to so many new ideas and ways of working. I think that is one of the powers of this whole approach, which is that you get to test out new ideas, come up with
Yeah,
innovative approaches, get feedback. So I think that is one. The second I would say is there is the opportunity to have continuity across G20 presidencies. So
right.
we have a series of 3 or 4 G20 presidencies, all from the developing countries: Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa. So many of our interests are in common and can be carried forward from year to year. So it doesn't have to limit itself to one year. And third is the opportunity to feed into COPs, World Bank, and other types of processes as well, other types of forums. So the World Bank IMF reform that we've been talking about in the climate finance space as well, the COP negotiations and so on. I think to me, one of the most interesting and the most um, I think meaningful discussions was actually on climate finance, because as you can hear, in every answer I'm bringing up climate finance, and the
Yeah,
issue is how do you actually generate new finance for climate action? And many new approaches have come up, including through the T20 process. Some can be things like taxes, like taxing business class or first class travel, or taxing shipping or aviation emissions, or the minimum corporate tax. There are many such solutions which only take political will at the international level. But there are also other types of reforms of, say, the multilateral development banks processes, making those more suited to climate action. Also, other kinds of institutional mechanisms which can incentivize climate action. So I think that has been one of the most rewarding, I think, opportunities, that issues like this have had the best brains in the world actually think about them year after year. And so when India continues in the Troika next year, even under Brazil's presidency, maybe as we go forward to the COP29 in Baku, which will happen at the end of this year, it is being billed as a climate finance COP. Maybe we'll see some of these ideas actually getting implemented. So that is something that I would highlight.
that's extremely positive, and I think very good to note. But I'm going to ask you a slightly more cynical question, and I think that would be one of my last questions to you, which is what is it that is not being talked about, and what is it that you think requires more effort and is just not being discussed right?
So I think, um, yeah, it's a very difficult question that you asked me, Ritika. One that has to introspect a lot. I think what is happening is that we tend to have the glass half full and the glass half empty kind of people, right? We have the
Yeah,
optimist like me on some days, most days, who say that you can have climate action in a way that is also good for the economy. And then there are those who are actually very nervous about what this might mean, especially for the country like ours. Might we be compromising? What will particularly happen to certain sections of the economy, certain parts of the country? And in a way, both of these are right. So what needs to happen really is that maybe the optimism of people like me sometimes needs to be tempered somewhat, and the pessimism of the others needs to be also, I think, exposed to certain realities, very fast changing realities of our world. I think there is more and more evidence that technologies become cheaper at a very rapid pace. There's an S-shaped curve that technologies follow. So I would say that definitely there will be ways in which humanity will meet and adapt to the climate challenge. What will happen, though, is that those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized right now to the kinds of stresses that we are seeing will continue to be the ones who are most at risk even to climate change. Um, Even when we have climate action, maybe people like you and me who are educated will be able to take the benefits of the new green jobs that come. But others who do not have the same privileges will have to be specially supported and taken along in this journey and empowered to benefit, or at least to be able to access those new green opportunities. Otherwise, the kind of inequities that we see will persist. So I think both of these approaches, if I could simplify it, maybe the techno-optimist approach and the approach that looks at climate justice and equity, these need to speak to each other and help each other out in a way that that the climate actions that we're talking about bring benefits to all, not just a few. So I think that is the one point that I would say needs a little more attention.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And what you said about decarbonization and development going hand in hand was, I think, the uh, most interesting point that came out of our conversation today. And it's actually wonderful to hear that. And it's the glass half full here. Uh, that's the part of me that's speaking right now, and that's great to hear. So let me just ask you a final, more personal question, which is, who are some of your role models who have actually helped develop your understanding of climate? You mentioned that your father was actually the reason why you were introduced to this space in the first place. So maybe if you could tell us who are the people who have influenced you to actually work towards climate change. That's one. And the second is, what are some of the important resource materials that you refer to actually, and someone else may can also refer to develop their understanding?
I'll actually combine both these answers because even before I used to work at WRI, even when I was a student, I actually used to really look up to the work of World Resources Institute, the World Resources reports that would come out. I think one of the advantages that WRI's approach has is that all the data is open access. Mm-hmm. So the research is published, the data is available. So I would actually combine both of your questions and say that that kind of approach, it has always been something that I have always read and learned a lot from, and I would really recommend the WRI website as a very accessible starting point. The blogs and the videos and all of that. We do frequent trainings as well for a lot of different approaches, a lot of different technical tools like for measuring greenhouse gas emissions or science-based targets. Even for our energy economy modeling, there's a lot of content out there. So I would encourage anybody who's interested to just feel free to use these resources and work on climate action in any way they can. Our modeling shows that there is no single silver bullet. Whichever sector of the economy you're working in, there is a way to contribute to climate action. So we just need to get started.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Ulka, for joining us today. Your insights have been extremely valuable. I'm sure when this podcast comes out, the audience is going to have a lot to take back from this conversation. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thank you.